Welcome to Bleach Revisited. I am Karker Gold, your host through the series in which we will be reading every single chapter of the Bleach manga, providing critical analysis of the art and the narrative, as well as personal response to the chapters and discussion of how these chapters connect to the rest of the series. So, if you're interested in any of that, you're in the right place. As usual, we will begin the video with a reading of the chapter that we are currently on. This is Chapter 67, End of Lessons. Hey, what? They stopped? Abandon your fear. Face forward. Advance. Don't give an inch. Retreat and you will age. Be afraid and you will die. Shout my name. Zangetsu! What? Why now? Bleach, Chapter 67, End of Lessons. What kind of Zenpakuto is that? There's no hilt or guard. It's not shaped like a normal sword at all. The old one was better than that one. Well then. Now that you've managed to draw your Zanpakuto, we can really begin. Lesson 3. Sorry, Mr. Urahara. You'll evade it the best you can, right? Why? I probably can't restrain it. Scream! Red Princess! Whew. If not for my shield of blood mist, I'd have lost an arm at least. Boy, oh boy. You killed my hat. All this from just one slash. Mr. Kurosaki, you're a scary kid. Lesson 3. You passed! Yes, it's finished. Thank you, Master. I did it! Yay, Chad, yay! Now we can go to the Soul Society! You fools! You've made a mess! Run! Out the back door! Excuse me for that. People are in deep mud if Ichigo is gone. I ran away from home to escape from Karen. But if I have to sleep out in the street much longer, I'll be a dirty rag. And that is it for Bleach Chapter 67, at least as far as the reading goes. Let's go back to the beginning of it, and I will provide you with a bit of my take on this, because there is a good bit to talk about in this chapter. So, discussion of both the art and the narrative, how they both help to bring the series forward, how they're functioning within the chapter, all of that, right? This is part 2 of the video, and what we typically do, yeah? Try to keep it from the grounds of solely being summary. It's easy to fall into that trap of just describing what's happening, but not how it's affecting. But I will endure. Anyway, one thing that I think is really cool here is that we start from Kisuke's perspective. So we're actually we're going back a little bit narratively to instead go to, before Ichigo has called out to Zangetsu and, actually manifested it, basically a few moments before where we ended the last chapter. And there's a couple things done here to really sell this as Kisuke's perspective. Obviously, we open with his signature clogs as he's stepping forward. We get this big shot of Kisuke But I think really what sells it is the zoom in on his eye and then this over the shoulder sort of look, especially with Ichigo turned away from us. So we get this real sense that, we're seeing this from the way that Kisuke would. Anytime that you give an older over the shoulder perspective in almost anything, that tends to align you with whoever shoulder you're looking over, right? You tend to kind of project into their perspective a little bit, and that's what's being done here. The other kind of significant thing, and this answers a question that I had last chapter, is whether or not Ichigo was all like what was happening physically there whenever Ichigo was conferring with Zangetsu. Whenever he went into that inner kind of world moment, was he physically there the entire time? What would other people have seen? And here we get confirmation that it is just Ichigo being silent and all of this kind of happening internally for him. So it's cool, he hasn't blinked out of existence or anything. All that inner world stuff, even before, I believe, was all sort of an out of body experience almost, but consciously sort of had, or perhaps like having like a daydream almost, but you're aware of it and it's very lucid and real. But for everybody else, they just kind of see you standing there. Of course, for the others, they perceive that this whole battle has stopped. Obviously, Kisuke has come to a stop because, he actually does have to play this pretty safe. He's aware of all of Ichigo's potential, and that this could be quickly dangerous for him, as it certainly turns out. One thing that I'm going to pause and talk about for a little while here are these sound effects. So we get this like that kind of thing going on, and I don't think it's that his sword is literally like revving like a chainsaw or something. Uh, there's two ways to really interpret sound effects in manga, especially, and this tends to be something that I see a lot in manga, less so in Western comics. In Western comics, you typically get strictly onomatopoeic sort of sound effects. So the idea is that they're trying to transliterate a sound, like biff, baff, clang, uh, pow, all that typical sort of comic sound effect stuff. You get your Marvel comics with you have Wolverine, his claws, they go shick, all of that, right? Anyway, here though, this isn't completely onomatopoeic. Instead, this is meant to be a sound effect that conveys a sense of atmosphere, of tension, and we've gotten that a good bit in Bleach, and I haven't really talked about it very much, if at all, which is the idea of using these sound effects to create this moment of atmosphere. That we're not meant to take it literally like there is this rumbling noise happening, but that is a stylistic thing that on the page is meant to convey this sense of mood or tone or something, right? That we get this shot, and I love this depiction of Ichigo that we get here. That we read him from above. We can see. I love that we get that. This is something that we've seen Kubo do before, right? Where a character will come from, they'll be depicted in both panels as like one larger image, and so it reads pretty easily down here, but that focus goes into that one part of them, and I think that's fantastic. And we get this moment where the sound effects completely gone away, and then the zoom into the sword as it comes back even sort of larger than ever, right? And I think here we have a sound effect that is onomatopoeic. In opposition to that, we get this like shunk, as or this like shing as Kisuke readies his Binahime. But this sound effect certainly is, I think, meant to be less literal, like not a thing that characters are actually hearing, but something for you, the reader, to kind of interpret and read into that moment. We often get this in a lot of these panels where a character will have a really intense moment and it'll be like doom. That's one that I've mentioned before, right? The DOOM one in Bleach that we've gotten a lot. We get a lot of like doom or boom, and it's not literally meant to be like a doom or a boom. It's not an actual sound that's being conveyed, but instead a stylistic choice that is conferring this moment of strength, or of like a camera panning out and you getting this really intense moment, or a quick zoom into somebody, that sort of thing. It's meant to help punctuate a little bit of what we have, and to carry this sense of the atmosphere with it. I will say this is probably one of my favorite things that the anime actually manages to incorporate in its sound design. So rather than having the sound effects visually, which is something that, of course, you might be familiar, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, of course, does that, where they still visualize the kind of the sound effects on screen, and that helps to kind of transliterate a little bit of, or I say transliterate, not quite literally, but it helps to translate or to convey the significance of those moments in the manga. But I think Bleach, I like the way the anime handles it, and that the soundtrack and the way that the soundtrack is used is incredibly evocative of these moments in the manga. And I highly suggest, if you haven't watched the Bleach anime, go watch the first 3 seasons, definitely. But definitely, like, if not the first 3 seasons, just watch a bit of the first season, just so that you can get the sense of how the soundtrack is used. I think the characters all are given pretty good voice performances as well in general, but that said, the soundtrack is really phenomenal in Bleach and gives it this texture that oftentimes I feel is kind of missing from the manga. Though we do have these sound effects to kind of give it that sort of tonality, so to speak. But it's something that, I find myself, even whenever I was reading the manga, I would read it with the soundtrack in the background on, just to help to kind of punctuate those moments, because it feels so very kind of connected to Bleach. And it's not the sort of thing where you could just listen to the soundtrack on its own. I mean, you certainly could. I think there's some of the songs in there are fantastic on their own, but whenever coupled with the scenes that they're meant to be with, they really, really help to, like, give this sense of atmosphere. And that's really, I think, what the sound effects are doing here. One last illusion that I'll bring up or I guess aside, really, that I'll bring up is, you'll see this in Nobuyuki Fukumoto's manga. So, especially Kaiji, which I've mentioned on this series before. I love that show, and the manga especially. But Kaiji, and in a lot of his series also, Fukumoto's used this sound effect that he's actually made, this onomatopoeic sort of sound effect, this Zawa. And it doesn't have any intrinsic meaning, but he's used it so much in these situations where characters are in despair, and he's had this sort of this Zawa sound effect populate the panels so much that it kind of clusters in the characters and makes it feel kind of claustrophobic and that they're really stressed out. And the anime has, for that, does a fantastic job of using it in the soundscape to kind of help to create the same sense of tension. Whenever it intrinsically doesn't really mean anything, but I mean, no words do. I'm trying not to get into a whole discussion of semiotics here on my Bleach discussion. But needless to say, I do think the sound effects in Bleach are really cool, and it's not something that I usually think about whenever I think about Bleach, is these non-onomatopoeic sort of atmospheric sounds. But we get them a lot in Bleach, and I don't know if it's just a mainstay of early Bleach that I've noticed them so much on this reread. Maybe they do persist throughout the entirety of the manga, and it's just not something that I've thought about or that, like, I'm consciously aware of. Anyway, hopefully they do something for you too, as the reader. I don't actually read them out because, again, I think they're part of the visual experience of reading Bleach rather than the auditory experience of, like, any character's voiced line or anything like that. So that's why I haven't incorporated them into my reading. I think that they're meant to be taken in as part of the visuals. So, you know, they're there. That's all I have to say. I think it's neat, nevertheless, and pretty significant, because it's not something that you see every manga do. Um, Other thing that's stylistically happening on this page that is pretty kind of easy to miss. I mean, aside from, I will take a moment to say this is a great post for Kisuke, especially him sort of realizing that Ichigo has found his resolve and readying himself for what's to come. I think that's fantastic. But also this kind of moment where, and then before I get to that, again, you gotta say that I really do love the way that Kisuke is sort of justified to the right here, and he's got his weapon drawn parallel to this panel. And so we get the reiteration of Kisuke, his weapon that's a serious threat, and then this line, of course, of abandon your fear. And so it creates this sequence of, like, Kisuke, this weapon that he's going to kill Ichigo with, and then this iteration from Old Man Zangetsu to abandon your fear, to overlook that and to face down this foe that is in fact deadly, and we are seeing that in this panel. What I wanted to get to, what I'm excited to talk about here, is we've sort of been taught throughout reading Bleach the way in which to actually read these sorts of internalizations. I talked about that a lot in earlier episodes, is kind of Kubo working through this sense of how he wanted to handle characters internalizing thoughts, are things being in flashback, are the ways in which different ideas would be, in dialogue, would be presented to you as the reader, so that you develop this sort of natural sense of what these are. And so at this point, whenever we get this, it's not in a text box, it's in this all black background. It's this sort of internalized, perhaps, because the outside's not black, because it's just the inside. It's maybe sort of internal character thoughts. But obviously we know it's a flash to what Ichigo's hearing, right? This abandon your fear. So we read that naturally as an internalization of Ichigo, thinking about what Old Man Zangetsu's told him, of course. But the other really cool thing is that Old Man Zangetsu's entire color motif is this all black with like a little bit of white, right? And so that being his color motif, as well as the color motif for Shinigami, where they have this entire black Shuhaku show with a little bit of white accenting it, both of those visually are represented here as well. And so this all black with a little bit of white, sort of the font, like the actual lettering, not only works as internalization for Ichigo, but doubles visually as internalization spoken by Zangetsu, or Old Man Zangetsu, and as this representative of his Shinigami powers, right? So there's something visually kind of working there as well, the coupling of those things. And it's not always that these sort of all black with the white inside is going to be representative of something that Old Man Zangetsu's saying, but I love that that is the case here, and I think that's fantastic and just like really cool stylistic connection that you could have had the abandon the fear just outside of the panel or done in some other way. We do see it here with these sort of expressed moments, and I think these are more like Ichigo actually really concentrating on those phases, especially because we get the speed lines here to accent Ichigo. It really helps to build the kind of intensity of that moment. But getting them as these in betweens here really works. One other big thing I will mention, and I think is pretty significant here, is that Ichigo at the beginning here, he's still wielding his base sort of Zanpakuto, right, that's been carved down. And we see here that he still has the big shoulder kind of strapped sheath for it, right? Keep that in mind. So I love Ichigo kind of draws into this Ayajutsu stance, which is the typical way that you would, the idea is, you're going to do this draw of your sword, and it's going to be kind of a draw slash. That's really cool that he's drawing it from the hip as he kind of leans over, as we know that Ichigo's usually had to draw his weapon from the shoulder, kind of impossibly so, but it's a magic sword. I'm not going to, give it that much of a harsh time. I don't think you can literally draw a sword that large from a scabbard on your back, is what I'm saying. I think it would have to unclasp and like open up. Anyway, it's a magical spirit sword, so it doesn't need to follow the rules. It just needs to look cool. Anyway, I do love that he does enter this sort of Aijutsu stance, and then he turns to face his opponent, which is, of course, the kind of metaphorical thing that's happening here too, is that he's turning to face Kisuke, both literally and figuratively, rather than fleeing from this danger. And of course calls out his sword's name, Zangetsu. And we get this, I love this very intense shot as Ichigo looks over his shoulder and finally is able to face him head on. The surprise, of course, by Kisuke by how powerful this sort of release is. I don't think all this energy here is meant to be like damaging. I think it's just like this huge amount of Reiatsu that is being unleashed as Ichigo unleashes his sword, Zangetsu. And notably, he doesn't have a release command in the same way that both Kisuke and Renji did, right? Where they have Howl Zabimaru, and I think it's Awaken Benihime, right? So, of course, or wake up, whatever I remember it being. Of course, here we have Tessai kind of clutching the children, holding them down, and I like that Tessai keeping them safe behind this rock is not just that, like, obviously there's this big battle happening with Kisuke, who's this known sort of dangerous entity that has this weapon, right? And they have to kind of make sure that they don't get hurt in the conflict that's happening. But Ichigo, which Tessai for sure would be aware of how powerful Ichigo is and the potential Ichigo has, right? We've gotten that reiterated before, is that Ichigo has all of this latent power and all of this potential. He just hasn't learned to direct it. And, in learning that, Tessai is making sure that, of course, Aruru and Jinta are protected, and he's even willing to protect them with his own body, which I think is really sweet. I love the big swirl of energy that we get here of all the smoke kind of coming together and the dispersing. We get Kisuke holding onto his hat as a reminder of what this entire lesson is meant to be about, knocking this hat off, of course. And we close in, and I love that we get kind of out of the smoke. This is not the only time that Kubo has had a character reveal their cool new powers and they emerge out of a big smoky expanse, but you can get the sense that he really loves that. And he draws it pretty well, I think, too, as we get some of those details coming into view. Here we get not a doom this time, it's a boom, but we see Ichigo's face and kind of enshrouded and looking down as we get this shot of Zangetsu released. And so, a couple things here. I want to talk about its design for a little bit. So this will be the next big little chunk of kind of just talking about what's happening. Obviously, it immediately gets commented on by Jinta that it's weird. The other sword might have been better, right? This idea that it doesn't have an actual hilt or a guard. And obviously it doesn't. It's just a big chunk of metal with this sort of wrapping around the portion that would normally slot into a handle. So if you're not familiar with actual like knives or swords or whatever, you have a tang that comes out of the back of that, and that's what you fashion a handle around. And so instead of even having a handle really fashioned around that tang, here we have just this sort of wrapping of cloth. It's really evocative of course, the cloth that is still on Ichigo himself, that sort of white cloth from the binding number 99, the first kind of chance of part 2 of it, where Ichigo got covered in that same cloth. And I think that's no, mistake, that it's certainly meant to sort of be visually evocative of this sort of binding, whether or not it's Ichigo sort of binding this own power of his own or not, or it's representative of sort of a Shinigami means of binding this power. I think that's more of a maybe stretch to talk about. I like that it is so large that it is poking into the ground and he has to lift it up out of the ground. That's great. But the idea of it kind of being incomplete or not having this handle and guard really speaks towards a couple different things. I think first and foremost, it speaks towards the nature of Ichigo's power still not yet being fully actualized, right? That he doesn't have a complete sense of his Shinigami power, whereas a true Shinigami would have, their sword that they know the name of, and it's got this, this whole handle and hand guard and all of that, right? It resembles a katana, and so they would have all of those things. And so Ichigo doesn't have those sorts of trappings. One, maybe because he's not going about getting these powers in the correct way. Two, maybe his powers are still incomplete. There's still more for him to sort of shape and mold his powers into. But the other really big thing here that I think is kind of significant about it is that this is a manifestation of Ichigo's power, of the way that he's going to wield power, this outward force, right? And from here on, whenever we think about Ichigo using power, it's because he's really felt himself powerless to protect these people that have been significant to him in his life, these women especially. So his own mother, and then later on with Rukia, right? And so he's got to awaken to this absolute power, this power that is uncontested. And so there's no place for it to have a guard to protect Ichigo himself. It is just absolutely, I need something that cuts in an entirely in its form. It is made to injure and harm. And so it walks this kind of fine line between, you are of course gaining this power, but it's very dangerous. It's not something that you can protect yourself with. Yes, you have to protect others, but in doing so, you wield this blade. And I'm reminded of Orihime's character poem. I believe it was Orihime's, right? That it's like, God, I can't remember exactly what it is off the top of my head, but it's something along the lines of, in order to protect me, you have to wield this blade. But if you wield that blade, I can't embrace you, right? This idea of, if we're, these people in their relationships are under threat, and in order to protect those relationships, you have to wield the power. But the power itself is dangerous and may even create rifts between you and those that you're seeking to protect. And I think to further kind of exemplify that, we have Ichigo here wielding the power of a Shinigami, right? Which right now the Shinigami are a serious threat to both his life, but obviously Rukia's. And so it's interesting that Ichigo comes to co-opt and wield the power of his aggressors and to wield it against them. And so, it's this whole thing of becoming like the antagonist or the enemy or the thing that you're seeking to sort of face against, right? Um, Not even talking about sort of the idea of dialectics. So in a dialectic of power, the idea is that you've created this sort of sense of the thing that exists and the thing that opposes it. It's these two forces in opposition to each other. It creates a dialectic. That's dialectic, dia coming from two, right? But anyway, in the sense that these things are in opposition to one another, but oftentimes dialectics continue to exist because the one opposing force begets the other one. And so, for instance, Ichigo awakening these powers and using these Shinigami powers to fight Shinigami, it only helps to propagate that sort of power that would be used to injure people, like, to like further prop up the Shinigami in the first place, right? So it's the idea that even in opposing a thing, you can kind of end up propping the thing up in your opposition. That's maybe less what's being kind of really focused on here, but I do think it is worth mentioning. But the whole point, though, is that Ichigo has to wield the Shinigami power against Shinigami, and that Ichigo oftentimes will end up wielding the power of his opponents against them. And so it does a couple of things. One, obviously, it sets up this whole idea of Ichigo really kind of making like a protagonist or like a kind of more moralistically sound use of the power. And so it's these ways in which power can be wielded to different means, and clearly our hero is able to wield it towards a heroic means, right? So it's neat spin on that and seeing how power can be wielded. Two, it really kind of helps to show both Ichigo being able to kind of having a point of connection to these antagonists, that he's building power from them, and so it allows them some sort of connection to Ichigo, and in a lot of ways for Ichigo to kind of have these moments where he makes these connections to the other characters that we know him for. But on the flip side, it makes Ichigo more monstrous or more like these opponents and less like his peers. And so it becomes, like I said, that reference to that Orihime poem, where there's this distance that is threatened to be created there because Ichigo has to wield this power, a power that is often wielded by these aggressors. And he's only needing to wield this power because of them. And so here we can see that Bleach becomes a lot more nuanced of a story than it is just about like, oh yeah, we have ghost cops that fight these ghost monsters. There's a lot more kind of happening in regard to power dynamics and towards structure and towards kind of a narrative that is more morally nuanced than it is straight black and white. Ha. Speaking of black and white, I do like that Zangetsu here does have reflection of this very large kind of black stroke through the back of it, through the kind of the spine of the sword, and that representing and kind of reflecting Ichigo's nature as a Shinigami. A lot of the Shinigami swords you will notice will have this very nuanced kind of black spine and then this white sort of edge to their blade. And that is, obviously you think, okay, how am I going to draw a sword? But as you've seen from Ichigo's sword before, it's been drawn pretty much all white. So here, with Ichigo actually awakening to his own Shinigami power, we get that darkness in his blade. That is an entirely black blade to represent, perhaps, that black power as a Shinigami that he has. Whew. Anyway, obviously the interplay of black and white being a big thing in Bleach, and the use of those colors we would see visually throughout. And there's a lot of interplay in those colors that I think is significant. The other big thing that I will mention with this design, I know we've been talking about it for almost 10 minutes now. I am going to make good on my promise that we will talk about this for a significant part of the episode, because it is very significant. This is the most significant thing that happens in this chapter, is that Zangetsu, awakened and revealed, finally gets put on display. But the other big thing about this design is we've actually seen it before, and I mentioned this earlier in the episode with Shrieker in the section about spoilers, but we've actually seen this design for the knife that Shrieker used to kill that child's mother. And that he had a kitchen knife, basically, that was wrapped in a very similar fashion. The whole blade and the handle was wrapped, and then later just the handle was wrapped. But identical design. It is this sort of kitchen cleaver design. And I think it's maybe, you could maybe argue that that is something that was kind of a minor thing. That it's just like, okay, well, Kubo had this idea, this design for a knife that he decided to use later for Ichigo. But I do think it highlights a pretty significant sort of design choice, in that by Ichigo wielding this weapon that a murderer wielded against a mother, which that's the initial sort of person that Ichigo wanted to protect in the first place, it further highlights that disparity between Ichigo reaching out for this power that he needs to wield to protect people, and that very power being dangerous and capable of harming other people too. And so I think that's meant to be there as a visual sort of connection. Whether or not how much of that was actually intentional by the author, I don't know, and I don't care. We talked about that previous episode. Death of the author, all that matters really is the way that we're interpreting this work and the way that we choose to enjoy it. And so because I see that connection there in reading it, and because I like that connection and I like to think about it, it doesn't matter whether or not it's intentional. The fact that it's there and that I can draw that connection, that I can have that personal context and derive more significance from the work myself, is what makes it entertaining, even if it wasn't intentionally authorial or authorially intentional. Anyway, all in all, love Zangetsu's design. I think it's fantastic. It does a lot to really represent Ichigo and all that. One thing I will say about this too is, and this is, whether or not this really counts as spoilers is up to you. But I don't think it's significant spoiler wise. But it is kind of a neat insight. Is we talked a lot about the physicality of these weapons being very significant, and that's the reason why I spend so much time in this section talking about Zangetsu and its physical qualities and how it's representative of all these different things for Ichigo and for the series. But one kind of significant thing that I mentioned before, so Ichigo used to have this big shoulder sort of strap to slot Zangetsu into. And you'll come to notice that every Zanpakuto has a sheath and a weapon. And Kubo actually mentioned this in an interview, an answer for a question that he had for his Club Outside, which is essentially a publication that he does where he answers various fan questions, and there's other stuff about Bleach, so on and so forth. It's a whole digital Japanese thing, as far as I understand. Anyway, basically Kubo explained that is significant, that there is this idea that all Zanpakuto are two parts. They are essentially weapon and sheath. And for Ichigo, whenever he awakens Zangetsu, another thing that makes it markedly different and kind of importantly different from other Shinigami Zanpakuto is that he doesn't have a traditional sheath for his weapon anymore. Instead, the sheath itself is actually this white part that is wrapped around the hilt of the sword. That binding that he has, that is the sheath for Zangetsu, that cloth wrap. So, kind of cool to think about yet another way in which Zangetsu is unique and different, and Ichigo himself is, of course, unique and different, and that is visually shown here. And it's something that I think, again, a lot of people that casually read this aren't going to think about the significance of the physicality of these weapons, or exactly what the characters wear, or their adornments, but Kubo put a lot of thought into it, and I think it is something that you can derive a lot of meaning from if you were to read it that way. And of course, this being a series in which I'm going to analyze the heck out of the visuals, you bet I'm going to talk about them. But yeah, instead of the typical sheath, we get this instead this really cool kind of netted together shoulder thing that Ichigo can kind of just slot his sword onto his back on. You'll see it later. Yeah, and here I love the chapter cover for this. We get to see Zangetsu from a kind of dynamic, different angle, and I do love the cloth wrap kind of coming off of it, giving this cool sense of, like motion, and sort of like we have this very hard-edged metal blade, and then we have this sort of softer cloth coming off the end of it. I think it's a fantastic design. And we get this would be colored red in the series, I believe. This kind of shoulder strap, but I really like that strap. I think it's got a cool design to it too. It helps to break up Ichigo's Shuhakusho and really kind of make his design unique in another way. Of course, here we get focused just on the blade and the discussion of how it's not shaped like a sword at all, that it's like this cleaver. And Tessai has this kind of intense reaction because I think internally Tessai is going through all of what we just described, where he's realizing the significance of not just Ichigo awakening to his unreleased, or to his release and knowing, the name of Zangetsu, and how huge that is, because normally it takes years and years of training for a Shinigami, right? We know that they go through academy to wield all this, and that they eventually, learn the name of their Zanpakuto and all of that. But Ichigo literally kind of creating this sort of Zanpakuto and awakening to it within this short amount of time, and the significance of it being different, I think, is pretty hard and noticeably hits Tessai pretty strongly. Here, of course, we also get this iteration where Ichigo says, he probably can't restrain it, and he goes about going to fight Kisuke. And I love that, as he draws the sword up, speaking of restraints, the remnants of that Bakudo fly off of him. And I think restraints is a powerful thing. Again, Ichigo is wielding this intense power, and he mentions this idea of that he can't restrain it, and I think that is incredibly significant. I like this drawn to Ichigo's sort of level expression, and I love that, juxtaposed against Kisuke being kind of cheerful, right? And then we jump into this very sketched panel of Kisuke having an intense reaction as Ichigo draws his sword up into the air. I maybe wish there was a little bit more of the actual art of Ichigo lifting up his sword in this moment. We do get the hand raised and the sword going up, but I really wish that we've maybe gotten a larger panel of that, because, it's kind of iconic as Ichigo lifting his sword and kind of bringing down this very large cleaver upon his opponent. We've gotten a lot of those overhead chops from Ichigo, and the fact that that is the first kind of attack that he delivers here with his awakened Zangetsu is fantastic. We get this call out for Scream, Red Princess, as he activates this ability to use this blood mist. And of course, we get that chop. And I love that we get the starkness of the hat flying off. And I love that it becomes smaller as it flies up into the air here. Just the intensity of that page is done really well, especially in juxtaposition of how quickly things were happening before. Here, I do like that we see all this blood first on Urahara's blade. We come to realize that that is not from a wound that Urahara sustained, but in fact is a ability of the blade itself, that the blade can bleed and then make a shield of blood mist from that blood. And I think again this is more of a spiritual sort of power. It's not like that like there's actual factual blood, but it's a manifestation of his Reiatsu in this way. And so it's cool. We get that Kisuke can kind of create this shield and kind of manipulate this blood from his sword in different ways, and maybe that's part of the power that it has. So we kind of get an answer towards the sort of powers Kisuke has. Of course, it's important to differentiate between this sort of shield and Orihime's. As you remember, Orihime's actually does completely negate and erase the attack altogether as it encounters the shield. Now, we haven't really seen the Orihime shield take damage or anything as of yet, but it's easy to be really reductive and be like, oh, they both have shield powers. Whenever I think the two of their powers are pretty significantly different how they function. So they are both manipulations of the user's Reiatsu in order to create a shielding effect, but I think that's where the uh, you know connection kind of grows thin. Anyway, I do like that Urahara had to use this shielding ability, and even then, he's like, oh, I would have lost an arm had I not used this shield, which seems pretty significant, right? And again, characters losing arms in Bleach. This will be a thing. The mention of cutting off Ichigo's hand, the mention of Urahara potentially losing an arm, and I think a part of that is because these characters have to use their arms to wield this sword, and that like this whole idea of being able to wield power is very significant in Bleach. And the idea of being able to practice swordsmanship, therefore, is very significant in Bleach. And so the idea of losing an arm is even more so significant within Bleach. So the whole arm thing, if you view it in the light of being able and capable to wield power, I think that's the way it's meant to maybe hold a little bit more significance than like I think a lot of people go like, what is this fixation on losing arms in Bleach? I think that's why. It's kind of like in the Yakuza, the idea is that if you do something wrong, you'll have your pinky cut off, and the idea is the significance of that is that you rely on the organization more because you can't wield a weapon without having that extra grip. You have one less finger to kind of grip a weapon with, and so then, therefore, you are less capable of wielding power on your own and more reliant on the group for your power. And I think that's something that we would see kind of handled in Bleach in a more kind of significant way with characters losing arms and this whole idea of one's own power versus their reliance on a society or a group's power. But we'll get there when we get there. Of course, I love the, you killed my hat, but he still puts it back on. Great stuff. And we come to find that, of course, Ichigo, he put all of his might into doing this big slash, and we get the huge kind of panel of showing us exactly what it had accomplished. So very powerful stuff. Probably the most powerful singular attack that we've seen in all of Bleach so far has come here from Ichigo. So that's pretty cool. I do like that we can kind of read this down and we get maybe this might be the shadow of like a mountain, but as we come down and look into the whole page, we realize that it is in fact the cleaved off part of one, which is pretty cool. We go to other characters, and here we come into Uryu, and he is using the Sanrei glove that he's gotten. That is, by the way, that is the name for this glove. I guess light spoiler, you'll come to find out it's the Sanrei glove. But he has this glove. We haven't seen it before now, but it is assumably what was in that box, especially as he's referring to his master, who I guess passed it down to him. But we don't have any other clear clue of what this does, other than it must be something very powerful. And I like the kind of connection that we have here between both Uryu and Ichigo, that both of them are training in a kind of secluded place. Their powers might be able to injure others in a pretty significant way, which is ergo the conclusion that both of them want. I think to a higher degree, Uryu is trying to do his thing secretly because not only may it injure other people, but he wants to kind of keep maybe these Quincy sort of things more sacred. Who knows? Um, But both of them have awakened to a greater power, and we have the focus on this glove and these kind of lines through it. I do like that, of course, the thumb and the index are darker. It makes me think because those are the parts that will interact with the energy arrows that one is normally to draw with the bow. Maybe that's significant. But it's cool visual design, and Kubo certainly likes drawing lines on people's arms, as we would come to see with Chad. Uh, the other thing that I will mention here, also with the whole glove thing and the connection to Ichigo's practice, is, at the very end, he's like, thanking his master for giving them this new power, and sure enough, Ichigo as well has his own sort of master to thank, his mentor, you know, uh, in both Old Man Zangetsu, as well as in Kisuke for helping him awaken to these new powers with a new form. Of course, we get another blast from Chad as he blows open the wall here. And I love the way that Yurichi is drawn. Fantastic stuff. But Yurichi kind of freaking out as Chad has put a hole through the wall and the alarms come on and they have to all flee. It's good stuff, and I think a really fun kind of comedic moment to end the chapter on after all the seriousness that we've had so far. One thing that I will say that I think is pretty significant here is that all three of our protagonists, while one is punchy, one is shooty, and one is slashy, they all have essentially awakened to powers that shoot big blasts, and that has potential to be pretty dull. I do think that it doesn't end up being that way, just because the strength of the kind of encounters that they would come to have later really ends up being less about these characters having significant, interesting use of their own power, but instead the kind of interactions that they have with the other characters and the sort of moments that are had are more character focused than they are battle focused entirely. But that is one criticism that I have, and I will say, I wish that the protagonist in Bleach had more nuance to how their powers worked, and I wish that there was more restriction in how their powers worked. Because at the very least, for Chad, Ichigo, and Uryu, at this point, we kind of get that they all do these sort of big offensive blasty attacks, and that's about it. And, I wish that there was a little bit more going on there. Like I said, the fights end up still being fine, and we'll come to talk about those whenever we come to talk about those. But it gives you a little bit less to think about, and if you're engaging on it with it purely from a fight POV, I think there's a lot to kind of feel like, oh man, I wish there was more. And you'll hear this criticism a lot of Bleach, where people will be like, of course Ichigo just gets into a fight and uses the same big slashy techniques, whatever. Um, and again, I don't think Ichigo's fights are meant to focus so much on that as it is focused on Ichigo having these connections to these other characters, having this bigger sort of more character on character struggle. And while I wish it was maybe represented in more interesting ways with their actual powers, there's still a dynamicy there that is significant and interesting on its own. Anyway, if you do want to see a series that I think handles its powers in more interesting ways and creates up all these interesting, kind of unique systems of powers, of course, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is always the first one that comes to mind. And as that show goes, or that manga especially, goes further and further on, you get characters with more and more kind of nuanced and even weird sort of powers, but they have to think of interesting sort of iterations of using them. Um, but even more than that, I think the pool that I'll make that I might have mentioned on this show before, but is worth checking out is Law of Ueki, which all the characters' powers in that are transformative, so they can transform one thing into another thing. And the main character's power is that he can transform trash into trees. And so then all the battles with him become like, okay, how is he going to use this like seemingly useless power of turning a piece of trash into a tree to overcome this opponent who might have something like they can, turn their spit into fireballs and like spit fireballs at him, right? So there's like interesting sort of nuance to those sorts of power systems. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think Bleach's power system is like effective and interesting and works for the sort of story that Bleach wants to tell. And I think there's a lot of really cool ideas of like, okay, what's this character's release for their sword going to be, and what power are they going to have, and it's all unique to the character. But then the issue becomes, well, you have to make that character still have unique and interesting powers. And so typically, the issue is that, of course, with all of our protagonists not having that much nuance to their power, but them just having straight up offensive power, they end up having to kind of be a little less interesting for that, unfortunately, just from a power perspective. So I will say that is one of the criticisms that I will personally level against Bleach, is that I do wish that there was more there, just power structure wise, for our protagonist, rather than just wielding I can blast you with this offensive move. But like I said, ultimately, I think the conflicts are still solid, and because the focus is less on just being like who will win out of this one-on-one fights and it just being blasty on both sides, I think that's the problem that I end up having with DBZ, is that like later DBZ ends up being both sides sort of just have a power where they can shoot energy blast at each other's, and it's like, okay, well, I guess I'll watch this until it's over, and one side is more powerful than the other for whatever arbitrary reason. And I think that's ultimately maybe the parts of Bleach that, in fights that fall the shortest for me are the moments where it's like, oh yeah, you weren't able to slash me better than I could slash you because I am stronger. And it's like, well, that's not interesting on any sort of conceptual level other than like, I guess that guy's stronger. I don't know. It draws me in way less. Anyway, that's all that I had to say for this chapter as far as analysis and response. I think it's a fantastic chapter. Obviously, I have a lot to say about it, despite, relatively little dialogue in the chapter. I think that reading was only like 4 minutes or so. So, oof. But pretty significant chapter nevertheless, as we see Ichigo awaken to his sword. We actually get to see the sword, we can see what it does, and we get confirmation of all of our protagonists really getting some level of not mastery over their powers, but at least capability of wielding their power offensively, and therefore able to strike back against Soul Society and perhaps free Rukia. So yeah, cool stuff. I like it a lot. I'm very excited to continue to read this series, and hopefully you are as well. If there's anything that you noticed within the chapter or the art narrative or anything that I didn't bring up, please feel free to mention in the comments. Similarly, if you want to talk about something that I did bring up, let me know too. I always am willing to bring this discussion further in the comment sections. This doesn't need to just kind of end on just me describing things. Last but not least, let's get into the spoilers, how this connects to the rest of Bleach, because there are a few connections that I want to draw. First and foremost, of course, I did speculate about if he was going into that, he was being sucked into that shadow world, but I don't think that actually happens for sure until he fights Kenpachi later on. But it is cool that it's sort of there, at least a little visually early on anyway. The significance, of course, of Ichigo's always being in Shikai, I think that gets highlighted in that line that Ichigo has. Let me get over to it. I guess let me address a few things before that. First and foremost, obviously, the nature of Ichigo's sword, right? It being abnormal. Obviously, we know that it's because it is not like most traditional Asuichi and therefore Zanpakuto, that is entirely made by Ichigo instead of being forged by Oetsu, and so therefore it is absolutely abnormal, both in the way that it was obtained, but also in the way that it is manifested. The other cool thing is talking about, the idea of the sheath and the sword. The idea of the sheath being the wrap, and that being representative of his Quincy powers and being all white, and that later on, whenever he gets his two swords, the sheath ends up being the smaller white sword, his Quincy powers, right? And that he combines the two of them. He literally sheaths the one in the other to strike at Yuha Bak is pretty cool. So, again, it's a visual sort of thing that's really significant about the physicality of a weapon that I think a lot of people just didn't think about because they're not thinking about these sorts of things with Bleach, but I think it's always been there, and I don't think it's a cop-out sort of answer. A lot of people tend to have a lot of misgivings about that final battle with Yuha Bak. And a lot of people are like, oh, what does Ichigo's Bankai even do? It kills Yuha Bak. I don't know what else you need. It's a god-killing weapon. What does it even do? I mean, it does the thing that Ichigo's weapons have always done. It cuts the enemy. But, the idea of it having that shattering and then looking just like his Shikai, that's significant for other reasons that we'll get into whenever they come up later. But ultimately, the important thing to know here, as far as connections forward, is that his Quincy power is represented through the sheath for his weapons, right? Which is cool because that sheath is also evocative of, again, the Bonkin kind of binding that he had on his Shinigami and Hollow self. And so it is this other force that is binding his power, that is restricting it in a way, like his Quincy powers ended up kind of doing. That he was able to really realize the full extent of either his Hollow or his Shinigami powers before that point in the series, because he had Old Man Zangetsu kind of misleading him even. Or at the very least cultivating this different sense of his powers. Nevertheless, I do love it, and I'll get more into it as the series goes on, because there is a lot to talk about as far as its design and its capability. Coming forward, of course, Tessai is probably amazed because he realizes the significance of this, not just of obviously it being an altered sort of strange weapon, but the idea of it being very significant that Ichigo is the first person to create a Zanpakuto other than, Oetsu, really, right? I mean, and it's arguable if he's really doing that, because he still does have the remnants of the Asuichi that Rukia's powers gave him technically. But that said, his power here as a Shikai is a complete manifestation of his own. And I don't know, I tend to read it as him actually making his own Zanpakuto in this moment. You might disagree. I don't know. Do you feel like he's still sort of manipulating the remnants of Rukia's Asuichi? But then the question is, of course, Rukia gets back her powers, and she very clearly has her own Zanpakuto. And so, was she given another Asuichi? I don't think so. I think she just had the old one that Ichigo had lost, that whenever her powers were returned to her, she got her own Zanpakuto back, kind of metaphysically, if that makes any sense. I don't know. Anyway, this is where the Bleach movie handles it better, perhaps. The live action one, geez, I don't know that I'd say that for sure. But anyway, at least the answers to those questions within its universe. Anyway, I read this definitely as Ichigo making his own Zanpakuto, which is kind of an unheard of thing, but something that I think Urahara would be aware that Ichigo would be capable of, at least theoretically. And the significance of Ichigo's Shikai and him making the Shikai is definitely not lost on Tessai. As far as Ichigo always being in Shikai, that's something that people bring up as another thing that they feel like they don't feel is addressed, but I think it's addressed right here. You just have to not expect the manga to tell you directly, but be able to actually infer things, which, some people, I don't blame them. They just want to read their battle manga. They don't want to think that much about it or infer that much. That's fine. But don't say it's a failing on the manga's part whenever you're unable to understand a part of it that has been told to you, just not explicitly, And I think that's the problem. I think Bleach got a lot of flack because it wasn't very explicit about a lot of things. So a lot of people that were just reading Bleach on a very surface level then complained about it because they, and kind of trolled about it too. I think it was really popular for people to kind of just diss on Bleach. But that all aside, here Ichigo says that, he probably can't restrain it, that he can't restrain these powers. And we've already gotten the sense with the Minos Grande encounter that Ichigo constantly has, his powers kind of on full blast, right? And so this idea of he can't restrain these powers, that he literally physically can't turn his power down from Shikai to a sealed state because it's just not what is naturally there, and it's not the way that he's been naturally trained here either by Kisuke. So Ichigo never had the traditional sort of, I have an Asuichi and I'm putting my Ryatsu into it kind of over time, and then I'm able to unleash that Ryatsu. Instead, it's, I have all this power constantly flowing from me, and so whenever I awaken it into this more powerful form and it's able to naturally sort of house that power, then I can't dial it down because there is no like lower sort of dial there. It would almost be like Ichigo putting himself towards soul suicide because he would have too much of his own Ryatsu in himself. I don't know, but yeah, he's literally unable to crank it lower than Shikai because he can't restrain it. Even, at least within the series that we see on screen. Maybe he learns that sort of control later on, and he's able to sort of put it back into a sealed state. But it's nothing that we ever see in the manga as it is written at this point. Anyway, here we get the Scream Benihime kind of ability that he uses, where he actually has this blood that he manifests into this mist of, like a blood mist, and makes a shield out of it. So at first it could be, you could really interpret this as Benihime having these manipulative properties of blood, but the blade itself seems to be kind of bleeding, which is something that we would come to return to with, of course, Unohana, Retsu. But you know, we are, Yachiru, obviously. But I think the big thing is that his sword's ability is really being able to kind of manipulate and reconfigure a thing. And so here it's manipulating this blood and using it in these different ways. So it's able to turn this blood into a mist. It's able to maybe turn it into a cutting edge. It's able to turn it into whatever he needs it to. It's a repurposing of this blood that this sword is able to kind of make his Reiatsu into. So I think that's cool that at least in the Shikai state, it is this blood and it's able to clot and repurpose in these different ways. But the Bankai is then just that greater repurposing. He's able to do that across the board. It's pretty cool. I like Benihime a lot. Of course, Kisuke putting on that damaged hat and being able to move on, even though he's kind of taken this sort of blow, is kind of a thing that Kisuke does a lot, right? Where, sure, he gets kicked out of Soul Society, sure, he's, on the run, sure, he has this damaged reputation, but he continues despite that. He'll even wear that upon himself. So that's cool too. Of course, we get maybe our first Getsuga, even if it's not named, that's there. The only other big connection that I want to kind of draw in this chapter is here we get with the Sanrei glove, this power that Ishida's gotten, and a lot of Quincy powers are kind of passed down or bequeathed upon another Quincy. I mean, the whole nature is that you have to teach another Quincy these techniques, or another human these techniques that are capable of Quincy powers. But then, even as we come to learn from the Thousand Year Blood War, all Quincy have powers that are bequeathed upon them by the Child of the Soul King, right? So from Yhwach, he's able to bequeath these powers and then take them away. And the Sanrei glove, I think, exemplifies that it is this bequeathed power that Ishida has, but then once he activates it and uses the Let's Steal, I believe that's what it is. Oh boy, if it's the Volstan Dig, and I'm just getting those terms mixed up right now, whatever. Kill me in the comments, I guess. But, he's bequeathed this power, but ultimately this power can be used up and taken away permanently from him. And so it's cool that the Sanrei glove does that in a way, that it represents the way in which Quincy power is both bequeathed and capable of being lost or taken away. Obviously with more agency on Uryu's end than Yhwach's, but still, it's neat nevertheless. And it also reiterates the use of Quincy using these devices, which is pretty significant. Quincy tend to have, at the very least, in Uryu's kind of following these sorts of devices. We see, I wish we had more focus on Quincy and the various devices that they would come to use in the Thousand Year Blood War. They do have their medallions, obviously, that they used to still Bankai with, but, there could be more. And they're here and there. I mean, like Pepe has his staff, Gerard has his sword and shield, but I wish that there was more focus on devices. I was really waiting for BG9 to be revealed to be like entirely a Quincy device, that, they just iterated on the device aspect so much that the Quincy themselves no longer like exists, that they have just become the device. I think that's one of the cool things about BG9, is this like logical kind of dead end of that artificing. But more about the Quincy whenever we get to the Quincy. Though, who knows? That's going to be quite a while from now. But nevertheless, it is a cool kind of aspect of the Sonray glove. I don't have much to say about Chad. It's cool he's punching through walls, but uh, it is what it is, what it is, what it is. Anyway, that's it for this chapter. I guess I'll. What panel do I want to sit on for the end of here? I guess I'll be on the "you killed my hat" bit. Whew. Anyway, all in all, fantastic chapter. I really enjoyed it, and thank you so much for listening to my discussion of this one and for following this so far. If you watch this whole video, give me a like to let me know that that is the case. As always, you can comment. That helps out the algorithm. But if you really want to help to push this channel forward, please do subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot, both in terms of retaining viewership for those of you that maybe check in every now and then. You'll have more reminders of whenever I upload stuff that isn't just this series, because I do have plans to do other things on the channel that are Bleach related, that aren't just these Bleach Revisited episodes, and I've already done a little bit of that. But then other than that, the other big thing is that you can also support me on Patreon. The link is in the description, and on screen now you should be seeing all of the patrons that are currently supporting me. So for as little as $1 and as much as you want to pledge per month, you can support me financially as well. But very, very big thanks to all the people that are doing that, and for anybody who just indulges in and enjoys these videos. It does really help me out, and it gives me a lot of encouragement to continue to do this series, which I'm doing both for me, but also for anybody that's interested in Bleach, As always, this has been Karakura Gold, reminding you that spirits are forever with you. Stay gold.